It is a pleasure to introduce the Honorable Greg Melchin.
Thank you, Professor Fry. It is indeed an honor for me to be able to be here and to spend just a few moments with you. 30 years ago, I graduated from this outstanding university. It has played a main part of my life in preparing me for really the opportunities that have played part and significant part of what's happened in my life. And I suspect all BYU graduates are here for other reasons too, as mine. My family has been substantially impacted by this. My mother-in-law, who's here with us, Geraldine Walters, lives in the Provo area. My wife, whom I met at BYU, I'm certain my mother-in-law was thrilled that she was imported to Canada and left the United States, as somewhat happens to the Americans. I thought I'd ask before I get going, though, how many here are Canadians? So we got a few in the audience that are Canadians. Mark Gilchrist, I see in the audience. Welcome. Mark is part of the fault for my being elected in the legislature. He's helped me out on a couple of campaigns when he was up in Calgary, and delighted to see you here, Mark. When I think back of the opportunities that my schooling has provided me in setting a proper foundation for really all of life's opportunities, you couldn't go wrong with coming to Brigham Young University for its regard, for its reputation, and for really the quality of education that you receive right here at Brigham Young University. I know when I went back up after and I got my chartered accountant designation, and looking at those of my colleagues who have graduated in Alberta, be it University of Calgary or Edmonton or otherwise, that the education I received here was first class, and I certainly was at par, if not above, really the learning opportunity that my cohorts and companions had had. But I want to thank the Palmer family in particular for sponsoring this lecture series, that we could have a chance and an opportunity to come back and give you a glimpse of other things that's happening around the world. In this case, in Alberta, and some of the things predominantly that are happening as a result of what's happening in the energy industry. Some of you may have come in today and received this at the back. I'd recommend you don't play with this while you're with not the washrooms close at hand. You will be left with this is oil. This is what oil sands are all about, and this is what they look like. And we're going to leave a little sample for each of you out there. But just as a word of warning before you open that up, if you wish to play with your hands, which you certainly could, you're going to not get it off the hands all that easily. So play with it some other time. I'm, this past weekend's been a special time for me too, and I said how much my education here has helped me in the assignments that I've had throughout my career. And yet, it's been about 10 years since I entered the political life, and we all know how respected politicians are these days, how high in the honesty, integrity scale everybody seems to list politicians. From a family, we had quite an exciting event this past weekend. A brother of mine had been my stake president for the past number of years, and was recently, just this weekend, called as to a member of the 70, of which my father has also served in those quorums. So when we get around the family and we talk about issues, of course we talk about politics as the most profession with the highest integrity versus those of the professions that in the ecclesiastical world that my family is serving right now. But I'd like to encourage you that politicians and that career and integrity are critical. That honesty and those values that you hear and learn are essential to success and really what you would do going forward. I've had many opportunities that come in the political world because of the fact that people could trust and would sense that I'm a person of integrity, because of the values that I stand for in our own faith, and because of those things that I apply to in all things that I do in my life. So those things will stead you very well. I remember one of the challenges you now have in politics is you have to take complex topics and you have to put them down into sound bites. Somehow you have to get these very integrated, related topics and get a media quote, one or two words. I was at a seminar one time when John Major was speaking, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he was telling about an experience that he had had with Boris Yeltsin. And the two of them were comparing notes and complaining about how difficult it was to portray to the media the things and the issues that were so complex in the world. And so they were bemoaning the fact of how you needed to get things down into one-word sound bites. And so this was at the time of the Soviet Union and CERN, at the early parts of Russia, and Boris Yeltsin talking about how things were going. So John Major asked him, well, how are things in one word going in Russia? And Boris Yeltsin's response was good. So not being satisfied with that, he says, well, okay, well, and John Major asked me in 2 words, how are things going in Russia? Boris Yeltsin's response was, not good. And so that's the challenge you have in synthesizing and compressing the ideas that you have into sound bites, of which is the world you face. I've long since learned that people don't want you to speak openly about all things. As a politician, if you're not very careful in the messages you give, just as even how we teach and educate people about the church, you have to be very selective in those messages that you deliver, or else people, and the media, will certainly destroy you if you're not careful in the messages you deliver. Anyway, on to the topic at hand. Alberta's at the forefront really of tremendous opportunity, and I'm going to get into why I would say that, and it's because of a resource that's in an area that's always been very heavily endowed with hydrocarbons. We've had very much of oil and gas and coal, very strong abundance. But what has changed the forefront today are the oil sands in particular. It's a deposit of, as I've said right here, if you looked at this, it's oil that's just saturated in sand. And really it's just a matter of extracting the sand. But the oil you get there is a very heavy oil. And the typical oil that you would see today being developed in Saudi Arabia, or really in the lighter grades of crude in Alberta or throughout the United States, would be a lighter color. It would flow easily, whereas this oil, even after taking out the sands, is a very heavy. It's like tar almost. And so you're going to have to also add some processing to it to take out the very heavy parts of the carbon, so it has a little more hydrogen in that oil to make it flow. But that said, we have deposits, and some of the greatest and largest resources are because of the vast and diverse nature of what's in Alberta. The largest, you might surprise you to learn that already in the United States, your largest foreign source of imports for both natural gas and oil is Alberta. Beyond that which you would receive from Saudi Arabia, beyond what you might receive from Venezuela or any other country of the world, Alberta is already United States' largest foreign supplier. Now, you also produce quite a bit of oil and natural gas in the United States, but when you look for your imports, you look very much predominantly about how much is in Alberta and how much is flowing to the United States at this stage. We have Saudi Arabia is typically portrayed as being the largest, both in resource and in production. To just give you a magnitude, they have in a proven category 264 billion barrels of oil in proven category. Now, their resources are substantially larger than that. The proven is an amount that they expect recoverable with today's technology, and also under the current price and economic conditions. Alberta, just a few years ago, was able to put some of the oil sands in a proven category. 5 years ago, there was zero amount of reserves from the oil sands in the proven category. And what's changed the world's perspective is because of technologies brought that over the decades of learning, putting it into 175 billion barrels of proven oil reserves in the oil sands in Alberta. That places it at the second largest amount of resource anywhere in the world, next to Saudi Arabia's. Though the resource is about 1.7 to 2 trillion barrels of oil. So only 10% of the resource is in the proven category. And the reason for that, this is all about technology. This is a very high-tech industry. You might not think of it in those terms, but this is all about science and engineering and chemistry. And so it's a very integrated, technical, research-related field. We likely expect that in the near future that we'll recover about 300 billion barrels of oil out of the oil sands just with today's technology. And so we do expect that we will see Alberta climb to being the largest, in the not too distant future, resource of oil of anywhere in the world, including surpassing that of Saudi Arabia. The difference, though, is that Saudi Arabia is producing about 10 million barrels of oil a day. Alberta is producing about 2. And it's going to take us some time, with billions of dollars invested over the next decades, to get those production levels up to those equivalents. And so we're a long ways away from being the largest supplier of oil, though over time we likely should and could be. I could talk very much about natural gas too. We have pipelines that take oil and natural gas to California. In fact, I was out on Long Island in New York not too long ago and saw where the end of the natural gas pipeline from Alberta went, servicing the New York market all the way up into the northeastern, the Midwest. So you find that those infrastructures of pipelines transporting every day seamlessly that product to the market, so that when you're there filling up your gas, your car, your gasoline at the tank, that oil is probably, some of it's coming from Alberta. In fact, even into the U.S. Salt Lake market, some of the refineries here are bringing oil down in from Alberta. But we look at another area, and I'm not going to have enough time to go into detail on it. It's sometimes forgotten because of the environmental impacts of the question. It's coal. There's more coal in energy. In fact, there's twice the energy content of coal than all the oil and gas in Alberta combined. That's how much coal reserves are in Alberta as well. But there are substantial coal reserves throughout the United States and throughout the world, far more coal than there is oil and gas. And so we're going to find that technology is the answer to coal again. I would suggest that coal could be one of the energy sources again of the future. It's been typified as this dirty fuel of the past, but it could become the clean environmental solution of the future. We've been participating in Alberta, I know, with the Department of Energy in Washington on a FutureGen project, which is a zero-emission coal-fired generation plant. Now, that plant hasn't yet been built, but it's the technologies that do exist that they're trying to see how can they make it commercially viable, so that that could provide electricity today in a zero emission, that you would capture all the emissions, greenhouse gases, if you want to get into the discussion of climate change, to everything from all the forms of sulfur and other forms of emission that would be harmful into the air. But what sets, I would say, places like Alberta apart, and I'm going to come into the United States too, it's not just because of this geological jackpot of Alberta has by its situation in the globe, but it is very much because of the structures, the policies that are in place. There are many places in the world that have tremendous opportunity and large resources, but we have set hard to put structures in place, competitive tax and royalty regimes, for example. We have a unique ownership. The province of Alberta owns the resource, but we rely specifically and entirely upon the private sector for development. So we have, through a royalty structure, the private sector paying a royalty to the province of Alberta. And you talked about the amount of wealth that's bringing in. Last year brought in about $15 billion to the province of Alberta. Surpluses certainly abounding substantially in the province of Alberta. But the resource is owned by the province and not by the federal government. In our Constitution in Canada, the provinces have responsibility for the economic and many of the areas of jurisdiction. Unlike here in the U.S., where your oil shales, much of those lands are owned through the federal government, and I know in participation with your states here in Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado, where you have vast oil shale deposits, you have a little more complexity in the sense that you've got the federal government and state governments involved in developing that resource, whereas at a more local level, we are a little more easily to do that. But one of the things that I'd say United States and Canada really have and are fortunate to have not related or not seen in the rest of the world are our structures of the private sector, and how well those really do and more quickly respond to the challenges of extraction in a high-tech industry like the energy field. I was at the World Petroleum Congress in Johannesburg, South Africa, a little about a year and a half ago, and I was I came with my executive assistant, Glenn Shepherds, who's there, my chief of staff, and the two of us were at that conference, and we would go around, and it was interesting as we met with other energy ministers from around the world. In fact, when the energy minister from Saudi Arabia showed up, he had this large entourage, and everybody'd be moving around with the energy minister from Saudi Arabia. And we met with a number of energy ministers from Africa and various other places of the world. And it was almost as if they were treated and they were like kings entering into some domain or dominion of theirs, of which everybody bowed down and gave reverence. Whereas in the United States, in Canada, that's not the case. And I would say we are very fortunate that that is not the case. Where we, though they're positions of honor, they are not positions of demand and requirement to adhere by dictate. And so you don't find, like most of those countries where they have state-owned companies that develop the resource, and then you as a private sector company have to compete with a company that's owned by the government who makes the rules. You're in a very substantive conflict of interest. And so you find that our structures here are quite unique in the United States and Canada that are going to allow the formation of people, of technology and capital that's going to be instrumental. Many places are resource rich but can't find the people and the capital to actually develop the resource because of those structures that they don't put in. At that place, I was asked to speak on revenue transparency. And so I was asking the energy industry, well, what does this mean, revenue transparency? Now, I'm a financial accountant, and I've had a financial background, and I could certainly give you a dissertation on some of the technical aspects of revenue transparency, but I didn't know. So the guys in the energy industry told me, says, oh, well, what that means in the world is corruption. So it finally dawned on me that I was fortunate that I don't have to spend any of my time considering, well, not any, but very little of my time considering our structures that allow for corruption, such as this. What they meant by transparency is they were expecting the multinational energy companies, your Exxons of the world, to come in and report the payments that they were making to government officials and individuals that weren't disclosed. And so because there is so much of that happening in the world, we are, once again, it is by the safe and rule of law that we've been able to establish in this continent that we are unique in the world in the establishment of resources. Land sales, just another example. The minister from India had came to Alberta one time, and we were meeting with him. He had been to London, to Tokyo. He'd also been to New York and Houston, and he was coming to Calgary at this stage and was looking to raise capital for investment in the oil and gas industry in India. And they do have, once again, some resources that would be worthy of participation. And what they would do is they put out a block of land that people could bid on for the rights to then explore. And they were going, this was in April of one of the years, they were going to have that land sale in May, and they announced the results in July. And so I asked him, well, how many of those are you going to have in a year? And he says, well, this one, maybe one more. And I said, well, that's quite interesting. You know, in Alberta, we have one of those every other week. And I don't have to do anything. In fact, the private sector initiates the prospects where they think are the best and brightest opportunities. They would come to the government. We will vet and make sure that those lands are available for bid. We will put it out to a public auction. The highest bid will win, and they're announced the same day. But it's because of those efficiencies of regulatory structures and the rule of law that you facilitate people and ideas and capital coming to develop it. So I'm just here to say, despite the fact, yes, we have abundance of resource, it is never by luck or by chance that you're able to tap into the wealth and the opportunity that would be with them. I thought I would spend a few remaining moments on the Canada-U.S. opportunity. I could go, I'm going to focus more on oil again because of oil sands are the predominant world attraction to Alberta these days. Though our natural gas resources, you could assess when it comes down from Alaska, if you look at your map all the way, the gas from the north from Alaska or the Northwest Territories, those pipeline infrastructures are going to come down into Alberta again. That's where those structures and pipelines will be built. They'll be built into a network that already has a vast infrastructure of taking that product, of be it natural gas or oil, throughout the United States and Canada into the eastern and western sides as well as the Midwest of the United States. In fact, some of those pipelines are being diverted all the way down to the Gulf Coast to tap into the refineries that are in the Gulf Coast. So the natural gas from the north, once again, is going to predominate very prominently in a hub in Alberta. The oil on the other side, you could take, if you take to the west coast of Alberta, I don't know how many know the geography of Canada as well, but from Alberta, we've got to still go across the Rocky Mountains to the west coast, to British Columbia. And if you take pipelines to the west coast, it opens up another huge marketplace. Yes, you could ship that down to Southern California, which is a market that our oil does not yet go. But you also open up the Asian market. From the western side of British Columbia, we are actually just as close to ship oil to China as we are to ship it, as the Middle East is to ship it to China. So you don't realize the geography, but the shipping lanes, and you're through safer waters than shipping through Middle East terrain. So what can happen just by Alberta is you start expanding into the opportunity of supplying a source of oil, and there are centuries of supply. This is not a decade passing thing. This is a sunrise opportunity, not a sunset. The opportunity is there because of supply and technology, but the United States, we're sitting very close here. I've met with many times with the Secretary of Energy for the United States, as well as many congressmen, senators that have come to Alberta, or we've gone down here. Particularly, we've met with your senators in Utah, Senators Hatch and Bennett, who sponsored a bill, or at least an amendment to the energy bill in the United States that said they asked and required that the Department of Energy in Washington partnership with Alberta in the development of the oil sands in Alberta and of the oil shales in Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. There is another resource, and it's not listed yet in any of the categories of proven oil, and that's your oil shales right here in Utah, Wyoming, Colorado. That resource is likely as large as the oil sands in Alberta. Very large. It's more complex and more difficult to extract. Rather than, as I left you with that sample, you've got that oil that's in this sand, and really all they have to do in Alberta is it's gravity. They just have to get the oil out, and they'll let the shifting of gravity, and the sand will separate from the oil. And then it's a matter of applying some other diluents to get the oil to flow and processing it to refine it. Whereas in the oil shales, you've got this oil, and it's not quite as mature, I guess. It's not cooked enough. It's really hasn't had enough heat and temperature over time to get it to the same grades, though refining technologies can do that today. But they have to get it out of rock. It's oil that's saturated in rock, this shale. And the technologies they've used thus far have been crushing the rock. As you can imagine how much more expensive that would be to take rock and crush it to separate the oil versus letting gravity and sand shift out in the oil sands. So in the United States, none of the oil shales are listed in the proven category, not even one barrel. Though I would tell you, we've met with a number of companies, some pilot projects. I could list Shell as being one that has a pilot projects in the oil sands and in the oil shales down here in the United States. And these are one of many that are coming forward. This one takes electric heaters down into the ground and heats it up so that the oil will flow out of the rock or out of the sands. And it would be light enough of a grade. You process it somewhat in the ground versus your refineries above the ground. It provides tremendous solutions to environmental problems. It also provides a neat technology to getting it out of the ground at a more cost-competitive basis. So you're going to find those kind of projects, be it Shales or any others, in the next little while. You're going to have enormous opportunity right here in the energy field in Utah. And it's in that context that Canada and the United States ought to continue to be, and in particular Alberta, more integrated in all that we're doing, in our thinking, in our regulatory approaches, in our industries. In fact, the energy industry of the United States is you name all the major players, they're all there in Canada, as well as the investment from around the world. It's in that technology and partnership that we ought to participate more completely. My pitch as an energy minister in Alberta to Washington, and certainly in the United States and here in Utah, was that we have a few things that we need to do. And I would say, one, you need to establish a closer ties between the Alberta government and energy, and with Washington in particular, and then more closely now to the states of Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, so that we share things about regulatory approaches, what has worked. I know Senator Hatch, when he put through the amendment, his recommendations were in light of the success that we've had in Alberta, that they ought to be coming and watching, and also ensuring that their policies are facilitating the same development here in the United States. Secondly, you mentioned, Professor Fry had mentioned, did you say 2.5% unemployment in Utah? Yeah. Well, that's well below full employment. In fact, you can't find people at that level. In Alberta, we're about 3% unemployment. And I would say the bright future for all of you here, there aren't going to be enough of you to take advantage of all the opportunity that's there. The limiting factor we have in Alberta, it's not the oil, it's not even capital, but it is people. Our growth factor is being constrained by we don't have enough people to do the things that are demanded and could be done. And the catch-22 of that is if you start attracting more people, well, you've got to build roads, schools, hospitals, and everything else. So that compounds the activity that's happening. In Alberta, we've had, last year there was about $32 billion invested in the energy industry in Alberta. About 10 of that was in the oil sands, but the rest of it, we drilled 20,000 wells last year. The research activity is enormous. The partnering back and forth between companies, between universities. We were talking with Professor Fry earlier about how we ought to be doing more among our universities here and in Alberta to look at the heavy oils. But the labor and supply chain and the intertwining of that between our countries is essential. Most of the big trucks and equipment, and a lot of it that we have, is manufactured in the United States and brought into Alberta. Much of the technology we have is developed in Alberta and or United States, shared commonly. Pipeline regulatory issues, development of markets. If we're producing 2 million barrels of oil today out of Alberta, and it soon's going to get to 5 and then to 10 million barrels, well, where's that going to go? We could send some of it to China or the Asian countries. And I'd say that's caught more of attention in Washington than anything else, and maybe that's a good thing for us. But we ought to be, where is that oil going to go? It's where is it going to be refined? Where are all of these substantial investments of refineries going to be built and processed, so that when you go and to fill up your car with gas, it's there when you want it, how you want it, at a price you can afford. So our labor and supply chain and the regulatory issues, but the biggest and largest opportunity gets into technology. This is where you're going to have, I would say, a great future, is in those with some skill sets, and there's a range of skill sets that are going to be required in these fields. You could think of all the chemistry or engineering or geophysical kinds of sciences are critical and essential to how do you look at this resource? How do you extract it? How do you process it? How can you find ways to deal with the environmental questions? One of the great challenges, and I must admit I remain open, maybe a little bit skeptical as to how the rush to conclusions that people are putting in the political world, are things like climate change. If you've got a risk to the hydrocarbon industry, it gets into the association that some are making, and I don't mean to say that they're right or wrong, I just would say, I'd say the science is still so shallow and still not enough developed to really know the cause and effect. But we need to understand those questions. So even the environmental science is going to play a very important part of development of hydrocarbons, and should play. I don't think there's anybody interested in destroying this world, our water, our air, our soils, our lands, and leaving it in a terrible condition for the future generations. And so finding and unlocking those solutions, once again, is going to provide whoever can with those golden opportunities. You look at the investment community, the finance community. I'd said last year there's about $30 billion invested just in Alberta. You're going to find equivalence amount over time coming into the oil shales in the United States. So if you're into the finance areas of focus, there's not going to be a shortness or a lack of need for raising capital. Everything to do with all of your business sides of the equation, everything to do with your human resource, because of attracting the people into the opportunity. But I must admit, I look at the opportunity that's there. It's been a little bit like a gold rush into Alberta. That's been part of the negative side of it. We have seen, and I've sometimes have felt that we have, and I've almost felt at times that I've been the oil sands tourism minister and not the energy minister in Alberta. And part of that's because we've had all the media of the world there. We've had all of the large multinational companies there. We've had political officials. We've had Prince Philip. We've had Secretary John Snow and Secretary Samuel Bodman. Dick Cheney was supposed to have come, but a certain event called Katrina delayed his coming to Alberta at the time. But we have and will continue to, I would say, be very much at the forefront of interest because of the opportunity that is there. It's an exciting time to be in Alberta. It's an exciting time to be in Canada. And I would say it's going to become an equivalent time, an exciting time to be here in this area of Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and the developing of the oil shales. You've only begun to see what could be, and you could play part of that future. Thank you. I'm looking forward to answering any questions you might have in the remaining moments that we have. Thank you.
Please feel free to pose your questions. We will end at 10 minutes to the hour, so you won't have to get antsy about getting to your next class. Yes?
I'm from the Maritimes, and since being at BYU, I've talked with a lot of Albertans, and there seems to be some resentment of the reallocation of resources between Alberta and the federal government, particularly to the eastern regions of Canada, which I wasn't aware of before coming here. So I was wondering, in your experience in the Alberta government, if you've seen any sort of implications for, Alberta's oil wealth bringing tensions between eastern and western Canada, or what you can see in that area?
Well, first off, there's some very substantial oil and gas deposits off the Maritimes as well, and a very bright future there also. Where in Canadian politics, we have, it's called transfer payments between provinces, and it's based upon the wealthier provinces transfer monies on an average. You figure out an average equivalent economic basis, and the wealthier province contribute for some transfer of funds to those that have less funds. And so in Alberta, the equivalent economic growth or wealth is about twice the Canadian average. And so you're finding substantial transfer of funds out of Alberta to other places in Canada. And we haven't necessarily really made as a policy that we're opposed to seeing that there's some of that. It gets into the question, the demand for how far should you come, because really the interest isn't so much about trying to help another area. It's about not wanting to create dependency and entitlements. And those are the challenges we face, I'd say, as to the structure of how we might facilitate helping a hand up versus a hand out of entitlement. And that's been part of the Canadian unique culture, I'd say. Do we resent Maritimes? Absolutely not. Delighted. Don't have any of those animosities at all. But that's part of the political debate.
Following on with the reallocation of wealth in Canada and the tension that occurs between the different communities, the same thing is occurring actually between Alberta and Utah. And I'm not sure if you're aware that all of the the refineries here on the Wasatch Front that are providing oil to the Intermountain West, 1/3 of that oil that's going into those refineries right now is coming from Alberta. And it's displaced waxy crude that has been developed in the Uinta Basin by the Ute Indian tribe. And the Ute Indian tribe is quite concerned about this displacement of them being able to find markets for their refined product, because they were used to selling it to these refineries, and now the refineries would much rather buy your crude than their crude. And what makes the problem worse is that the pipeline that delivers your crude, your syn crude, to their refineries is going across the Ute Indian tribes. So the Indians are on a warpath, and I'm just wondering if you have seen similar conflicts in other places related to displacing resources that have been traditionally been coming from other places.
You know, that's huge questions that come in that. You're absolutely right. I'm aware that Alberta Oil Sands, because you've got such a predictable long stream, steady flow of oil that can be guaranteed, and a certain consistency and quality of oil, that there are many reasons that it is, I'd say, becoming more so of a fuel of preference. But so we are displacing other sources. Montana also, I know, in filling pipelines, they've displaced some of the oil, lighter grades of crude actually than even oil sands. Though I would say that there still is such a demand, and really where the opportunity ought to be focused is not that we need to displace maybe temporarily one versus the other, but there's still going to be such a large demand for oil in North America. The United States consumes about 1/4 of the oil of the world every day. About 82, 83 million barrels of oil today is produced in the world. The United States consumes 22 million barrels of oil a day. And so the question I know the United States even looked at is dependence upon foreign. You know, are you going to look at dependency upon Middle East oil or Venezuelan oil, or should you not develop your resources more, and I would say in a more safer, more secure environment, be it Alberta, be it even all the oils out of Utah, including those that are displaced today. But those are going to be temporary, I would say, in this sense, that as you find more oil coming on, you're going to displace some others by pipeline or refining capacity. But sooner or later, we're going to have to develop new pipelines and more refining capacity, both. And so where would that refining occur? One of the challenge Alberta has is we'd like some of that refining to happen right in Alberta and send more finished products rather than even just raw products to the United States. Though huge competition, I'd say what's going to happen is a bigger competition for Alberta refining is the Gulf Coast. Pipelines being built to take it right down to Houston area because of the huge infrastructure of refining capacity that's displacing even some of our own refining capacity. Markets will sort those out, and that's one of the things that we've tried to fundamentally encourage is rather than demanding a regulatory approach that somehow you can centrally plan these things and find the long-term solutions, markets are very efficient at finding the best use for today and long-term planning, and where the risk then is borne by those market investments versus government at hand. That said, with those First Nations and Native groups, those are the same questions we face in Alberta. Extracting oils out of areas, taking pipelines across First Nations kinds of lands, and how are they involved and how do they participate, and we got to find solutions to those or else we will never get the permissions. If you've got an answer, we'd love to hear it. At the back, and then we'll come forward.
Because a lot of people say that the extraction process has been one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, what implications for like the Kyoto Protocol and Canada's commitment, Canada's international commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions do you feel that
You know, Albert, the oil sands are getting all the attention, but I tell you again, most of the activity is still on the conventional side of greenhouse gas emission. It's true that the growth will cause more greenhouse gas emissions. That's true. Most of the greenhouse gas emissions, quite frankly, is on the transportation side of the factor. Your car, my car, airplanes, everything else. That's where predominantly the greenhouse gas question. It isn't so much on the extraction side. Though I would say this, I'm I am going to say that we have not been in favor of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is a political accord. It does not solve, if you believe the science, and I must admit I remain a skeptic only in the sense not to say it's right or wrong, but I'd say we don't know enough, and we ought to be committed to having open minds and not to squelch the debate among science. I hope we would never intimidate science continuing to study these questions. That said, we're going to take a very proactive approach and be precautionary. So how do you do things? There's enough technology today to capture from the extraction side all of the greenhouse gases. There's a great opportunity in Alberta that we're looking at for capturing, pipelining the carbon dioxide and injecting it back into mature oil fields, which will help you repressurize those fields to get more oil out of the ground. So we are very actively looking at how do you turn a challenge into an opportunity that would eliminate greenhouse gas emissions, put it back into the ground, and also provide a further opportunity for more oil to be extracted. Kyoto Protocol, you don't have the Asian country signatories. The United States is not a signatory. If Canada shut its whole self down, we would have almost zero impact in the world on greenhouse gases. We are just too small of a population and of an issue to solve the problem. So we want to be part of the solution by technology. We want to be a solution by providing good innovative ideas to it. And I would say that there are great thoughts. The question I would say to you, we could have zero emission greenhouse or other technologies today. Are you willing to pay maybe twice? If you think $2 to $3 of gas is expensive, are you willing to pay $5 at the pump? Are you willing to pay more for heating your home? Are you willing to pay more for the car that you buy? Because there are technologies today that can do that, but economics of cost benefits are always the questions you and I value every day in figuring that equation out. So we as consumers are going to be the answer to this question.
A few years ago in this lecture series, we heard there's a certain political instability in Canada that Canada might break up. That would greatly affect the energy situation. Is the situation more stable in Canada now? Is there a likelihood of that?
Well, I'm here to tell you that the Alberta, most of the energy of oil and gas is in Alberta predominantly, though there's good deposits in other provinces. A breakup of Quebec, which is always the question, won't have any impact because the pipeline and infrastructures seamlessly transfers that every day across the borders. It won't be impacted by a political question. That said, there was a recent election in Quebec just the other day, and a new government was still formed. In fact, the separatist government only had a third support this time, the lowest showing they've had of support in 30, 40, 50 years. So I'd say even in the threat of Quebec separation is very nominal in Canada at this stage. Please.
In the papers that you sent out, it talked about Canamex and transportation between Alaska down through Alberta, down through Utah to Mexico. How is that developing?
Where we've really been promoting in conjunction with the United States and Mexico is this Canamex corridor. All the highway, I-15 becomes that corridor in the United States. And so we've been twinning the Alberta highway from that border of the United States all the way north. It'll eventually connect up and take you all the way through the Alaska highway. But yeah, that's part of the long-term structures. We know that Canada-U.S. has more north-south trade than we do have east-west. In Alberta, we have more affinity in many respects with the United States than we do with, say, Ontario, though we do a lot of work with Ontario and Quebec. A lot of our trade goes north-south, and so trucking and transportation is an essential piece of that. For this all to work, we've got to have better transportation network corridors. So seeing that you have highway grades to the same level all the way north down to Mexico is part of that solution. And that's coming along in all of our countries.
This is a hypothetical situation, but do you think Alberta or Canada would pressure Alberta ever into using oil as a bargaining chip for other initiatives? I know bumper has just been fixed, but such as that, say, we're going to cut down oil unless you kind of open your border for other groups to happen. Do you think that will ever happen?
Well, I know when I was energy minister, that was asked of me a number of times to say, do we turn off the tap, stop the oil and gas from flowing to the United States. We do have no interest in doing such a thing. United States, they're your largest customer, best friends, relatives, family, my own family. So we are so interconnected, and we want to keep it that way among our best friends and allies right here in the United States. Do not want to escalate one problem because we have so many successes on everything else.
The Arctic, this is sort of, they say there's so much tremendous potential there, and that Canada wants to take domain of that, the United States wants to remain international, and Denmark wants to move in. What?
I see our time is spent. The Arctic, those are lines that are drawn as to who owns which lands, and there's some debate on that at this stage. I don't know how to answer that question at this stage, but the Arctic will yet be a prominent place of the future, and those are lines that will have to be clear and delineated.